What's up, my dudes? So in this video, I wanted to make a interesting, different sort of guide, sort of a, like, in general, motocross simulator guide on just some of the basic heavy hitter things that you really need to understand when you first start getting into these simulators. You know, when you're coming from these arcade motocross games, I don't care if it's you're getting into MX Simulator or if you're getting into MX bikes, anything with that sort of next level or whatever kind of future simulator or simulator hybrid, anything that's got any kind of simulator sort of elements to it, all right? This basically applies to that, right? So let me just get right to the point here, okay? There's one really giant thing you got to understand, and I see this every day with a lot of these guys getting into a simulator for the first time, right? This is probably one of the biggest beginner mistakes people make with dirt bike simulators, okay? Listen, your suspension on the bike specifically is about 5 to 10% of your overall how fast you are in the game. 5 to 10%. It is the most little minuscule fine-tuning, something you don't even need to mess with until you're at least like pretty solid, like 500 to 1,000 hours into the game. You don't even need to touch your suspension, okay? I feel like so many of you guys get this impression that your suspension in the game, specifically like, you know, your rebound, fork, you know, shock, all that type of stuff, rebound, compression, fork oil level, all that stuff that's your actual suspension settings. I feel like so many dudes that just get into these simulators, the first thing they want to do is go in there and change all that shit, right? Like as soon as they get into the game. And I'm telling you from experience, that shit does not do as much on the bike as you would think in your head. It does not even do nowhere near as much as you think it would do. What you're thinking in your head that suspension does in these simulators, the setup of the bike is what does that, not really the suspension, okay? A lot of people get this shit confused, and I've noticed this from playing MX Simulator, playing MX bikes, like, dog, I can go in there with a totally stock suspension. I'm talking literally stock. 50 down the board on MX Simulator, stock suspension, and I'm maybe a second or two slower on a track with stock suspension, literally a second or two slower. And I've made multiple videos on it before. It's not like you can't hit a certain jump rhythm because you have stock suspension. It's not like you can't hit a certain triple in rhythm because you have stock suspension. Or you can't hit whoops because you have stock suspension, right? Everybody and their grandmother gets this idea that you've got to have this super pro suspension setup to even be able to get through a whoop section on MX Simulator, right? Or to even be able to triple into a rhythm. You got to have this pro suspension. I'm just here to tell you that's bullshit. That's fake. That's fake. I don't know who the fuck came up with that, but that's fake. The shit that actually matters, the stuff that is actually going to determine whether or not you can go through a whoop section or hit a triple in or huck the bike or do all that kind of shit. What actually, you know, matters, what actually determines that is your setup. It's not your suspension, right? A lot of people get those two things kind of confused. Some people include suspension in the setup, but in reality, I consider them two different things. I consider your setup being things like your stability, your advanced stability, your rider mass distribution, you know, your different brake settings, your vertical, horizontal spring shit on MX Simulator, the actual movement on the bike. That's what I consider your setup, right? Things like have wheelies to stop wheelies, not stop wheelies, front wheel, anti-lock, not anti-lock, you know, all these other little things. Those are the things that actually really matter, okay? Your stability and your rider mass distribution and your vertical and horizontal spring shit, everything under gearing on MX Simulator matters 3 or 4 times as much as anything you could do with your suspension. Everything above your gearing, right? Everything under your gearing matters so much more, it's insane. That's what actually changes what you can do on the bike, because that's what's actually changing the movement and the looseness of the bike, right? I still see it to this day. So many dudes get into these simulators and they're like, oh man, they'll have like 100 hours into the game or whatever, right? And they'll be like, oh man, I'm changing my compression, I'm changing my rebound, it's helping me. So, dude, you don't even know what the fuck it's even doing with that much time into the game. You don't, period. You don't really know if it's actually making it better or worse because you don't even have enough time into the game. That's what I'm saying. The suspension, like compression, rebound, fork oil level, all that kind of shit, preload type bullshit settings, right? All of that is so fine-tuning type shit. If you're not damn near to the pro level, I'm telling you, it ain't even really gonna matter at all. It's not. It's really not. A lot of times, it's going to end up hurting you more than it helps you if you try to go in there and jack around with your actual suspension settings when you're not really deep enough into the game. Like I would say you don't ever even need to touch one iota of a suspension setting on MX Simulator until you at least have 500 hours clocked into the game. At least. Don't touch any of that shit. Now, if you want to go in there and lower your stability, raise your rider mass distribution, jack around with your vertical horizontal spring shit, hey, go for it. You can do all that as soon as you get into the game, or days and days after you've played the game. You can start doing that right away. All that kind of stuff, your actual setup, that's the type of shit, right? You take the bike from being a very stiff, stagnant, when you first get into a simulator, everything feels super stiff and it's hard to turn and you can't hardly move and you get stuck in the air and you can't bring whips back around, you can't hardly turn. It's this real, restrictive feeling on the bike. Your setup changing is what affects that. That's what gives you more movement to be able to control the bike over whoops. Things like stability, rider mass distribution, all that type of shit. That's what makes it to where you can actually huck the bike on a triple in on a supercross track. That's your vertical horizontal springs and all that type of shit. Everything under your gearing when you're looking at it on the setup page, right? Everything under gearing. That's what really affects the feeling of the bike. And I've noticed this shit on MX bikes too. Guess what, boys? I'm still running stock suspension on MX bikes. Still. You do realize that, right? I just want to make that clear. When it comes to the actual garage suspension settings on MX bikes, I am still running 100% stock on that. I've not changed the compression. I've not changed any of it. And I can still big hoss on some of these supercross tracks. And I don't even have a lot of time into the game, but I'm just saying, it ain't like I've got some sort of special suspension setup, or I can hit the whoops fourth gear tap because I've got some, super secret suspension setup on MX bikes, so now I can hit the whoops fourth tap, or, oh, now I can hit that quad on that supercross track because I have my suspension set a certain way, or now I can really rail around that corner because I have my suspension. No, that's bullshit. It has no, that doesn't even really matter when it comes to that. Do I have other things changed on MX bikes? Things like my actual setup? Yeah. That's the kind of stuff that I have changed. But when it comes to suspension, I don't have anything changed yet. Right? And I can still get around a supercross track. I can still whip the bike over. I can still do a lot of shit in the game with fully stock suspension. So you start to realize how this is how all simulators are, man. The suspension is so much more of a fine-tuning element than what a lot of people get it in their head. You know what I mean? It's like they'll go to thinking they need to change their compression and rebound and all that before they even change their stability or their rider mass distribution or their vertical and horizontal springs. It's like, dog, you're doing this shit backwards, I'm telling you. You don't need to fuck with the suspension of the bike until you have the setup and the feeling of the bike as loose as you can possibly handle it, right? Once you've got it to the point where you've got the most movement you can handle, which obviously advances with your skill over time, but that's the stuff you want to be changing before you start messing with suspension. I'm telling you. Like, if you took the piece of the pie of everything that makes you a certain speed on a simulator, I swear to God, your suspension would be like 5 to 10% of that. 5 to 10%. And your setup, things like your stability, rider mass distribution, vertical horizontal springs, all that type of shit, advanced stability, right? All that accounts for like 40% of how fast you are in the game, or more, 40 or 50%. And then obviously there's like a 30% that's actual skill. There's like another 20% that's, how warmed up you are and how long you played the game and how consistently you played it. You know what I mean? How much your mind muscle memory is intact, right? But I'm telling you, when it comes to the suspension part of it specifically, it is the smallest piece of the pie of what makes you fast in a simulator. Of all the shit, it's the smallest thing. And I think so many people get that tricked in their head where they think it's the biggest thing that makes the difference, how you're going to ride the bike. It doesn't, dude. I'm just telling you, it doesn't. It's everything else about your setup that changes that. So I don't know where a lot of dudes get that idea from. It almost seems like I thought that as well at the beginning. I don't know if that's coming from these arcade motocross games where the only real changing to the setup or anything to the bike is the suspension itself, right? I think that's kind of where that comes from. I'm not really sure, but that is a humongous tip to a lot of you guys, and that's a very general, across the board motocross simulator tip right there that will save you so much time. It's insane. So, and the other part to that is, dog, you got to understand, motocross simulators are meant to be difficult, okay? They're meant to be that way. They're meant to be 10 times or more as difficult than these arcade motocross games that you're playing. So you got to understand you're stepping into a whole nother realm, a whole nother kind of game, right? It's not, and a lot of people kind of take that in two different ways. Some people get alienated from it and think it's just like such a barrier to entry. They can't learn it. It's too difficult. It's one of those things, like, once you play it enough, it gets to the point where it becomes just as easy as playing an arcade motocross game. Like, when I go in there and play MX Simulator nowadays, after having 10,000 hours into it, I swear to God, it feels like I'm playing what used to feel like how easy Reflex felt back when I played that a bunch. That's what MX Simulator feels like to me now. It's not like some impossible thing. Once you played it an astronomical amount and your mind muscle memory is just so intact with the way you have all those little things set up on your bike, the way you got the movement set up, the way the kind of controller you're using, all that type of shit, comes together to create that mind muscle memory. That's what allows you to go fast in these simulators, period. That is the number one thing. It's mind muscle memory over days and days and weeks and months of consistently playing the shit over and over and over and getting used to a certain, setup that you're running and not changing it every other day. Of course, you do need to advance the movement that you have and how loose the bike is over time, because obviously the more you play it, the better you get at it, the more you're going to be able to handle a looser setup. And obviously the looser you make the setup, the faster you're going to be able to go through whoops, the faster you're going to be able to go through roughness, the better you're going to be able to huck the bike over big supercross rhythms. It just makes everything, it makes it easier in one way, but then at the same time, you got to have the skill to be able to control the bike when you get that much movement on it, right? So that's kind of the whole balance, right? You've got to have a setup that fits your speed and skill level in these simulators, and that slowly gets worked up over time, right? So like, the first week in MX Simulator, you might have your stability at like 100 or 80, and you might have your rider mass distribution at like stock, like super low, but then once you get like 3-4 months in the game, you're probably going to have stability like 20 or 10, right? And then you're going to have like rider mass distribution like in the middle or even a little higher. So that you slowly work those different things up. Once you learn the setup settings that sort of create the like spectrum of restricted, beginner, basic, very restricted feeling on the bike, all the way to like super loose, lots of movement, hard to control. Once you learn what settings, control that, right? That's when you learn these simulators. That's how you figure it out. So, like, for instance, let me just give you a little tip here, okay? For MX Simulator, for instance, like your rider mass distribution is stock at like 0.33, which is the most restrictive, lowest amount of movement made for beginners. You could call it like the most handicapped, end of that spectrum of that setting, right? And the more you raise that rider mass distribution, point by point by point, it's just getting less and less handicapped, more movement on the bike, less and less restrictive. And once you get all the way to the top, I think it's like 0.50 or something, that is the maximum amount of movement, the basically lowest amount of handicap to that particular setting. Okay, and when it comes to stability, it's kind of the opposite in a way. The higher the stability you have is the handicapped, restrictive feeling. You can't turn, you can't whip, you can't bring the bike back around. And the more you lower your stability all the way down to zero, once you get to zero, that is pretty much the maximum movement and the pretty much no handicap to that certain setup option, right? And those aren't just the only two things that affect that. Like, just like I'm saying, everything under gearing on MX Simulator affects that. So your vertical horizontal springs is going to affect that. You just got to get in there and play around with it. And I'm telling you, nobody taught me how to do this shit, by the way. Nobody sat here and told me how to, oh, Spencer, you got to slowly raise up your rider mass distribution over time. Oh, Spencer, you got to do this with your vertical and horizontal. There wasn't no pro taught me how to do this shit. You want to know how I figured it out? I got my ass in there and put 10,000 hours into the game and tried everything under the fucking sun over years and years of playing the game and figured out how the shit worked. That's what you got to do, man. It's almost like it's so complex, the way, like the mind muscle memory, how much time you got to put into it, your skill on the bike, how it feels to you, and how all these different setup things intertwine with that and affect that. It's like if you don't go through it, you don't put the time in, and you don't actually experience the shit for yourself, it's almost like you can't even explain it. You know what I mean? It's like you can't, it's so hard to explain. So that's one of the biggest tips ever. Stop trying to blame yourself being slow on your suspension. Stop trying to blame it on all this other shit. If you'll just put more time into it, I promise you the shit will get easier. I promise you will start to naturally learn things the more time you put into it. And however much time you got it in your head that you need to be putting into these simulators to get fast, multiply that by 10. That's about where I would put it. Or even in some cases, multiply it by 100. Some of you guys ain't even in the understanding realm at all of how much time you got to put into these simulators to really start to understand them and get fast in them. At least for MX Simulator. It may not be quite that extreme in MX bikes. I know it's not quite that extreme in MX bikes. I would say it takes you about half the time on MX bikes to get to a certain speed level as it would on MX Simulator. MX Simulator is a tough son of a bitch, man. You hit a wall and a half. You hit multiple walls. I can't tell you how many times I was sitting there playing MX Simulator and thought, there is literally no way in hell I can get faster than this. There's no way. It's impossible. The bike will not go any faster. And then I sat down and played it every single night, raced every single night for another 3 months. Wow. I'm like 2 seconds faster than I thought was literally impossible. Wow, that's insane. Okay, surely now, there's no way I can get faster, right? Surely now, it's just, there's no way. We got the bike maxed out, it's to the limit, can't get any faster, right? So then, you sit down, play the game for another 6 months, every single night, 4 or 5 hours a night. Then you wake up and realize, what the fuck was I even thinking? Now I'm literally double the speed of what I thought was totally impossible like a year ago. It's got this ability to have this absolutely endless skill gap. Specifically MX Simulator. MX Bikes is not quite to that point yet because the physics are not totally finished, but with MX Simulator, it's like, dog, that shit is so endless that it's almost like you can't even, a lot of times you can't even see where that next level is. You can't even see where that next, speed level is because it doesn't even seem possible. So it's almost like you just got to grind the game, play the game every day, and then it just starts happening, man. It really does. And then the shit just all starts to make sense, right? Even if somebody sits here and tries to explain it to you, if you don't have at least 1,000 hours in MX Simulator, you ain't really going to understand the shit. You're just not. You're just not. It's just that simple. So these simulators are hardcore, bro. MX Bike specifically, at least right now, is a lot easier to get into. It's, the bike just in general feels like you took MX Simulator and then dipped it down in some arcade sauce, right? So it just makes it feel a little more natural going from like an arcade motocross game to MX Bikes than it would going from an arcade motocross game to MX Simulator. That's like hitting a fucking brick wall, right? Oh my God, that shit is insane. I mean, it's going to take you weeks to even fucking hold the bike up. And then another month to even get around a track without falling over. And then another month to even think about trying to like hit a triple in or anything. And then another month to even think about trying to throw a whip. And then another month to even think about actually going through a hardcore whoop section. It's like you go through so many different stages along the way with MX Simulator, and every part of it is just so rewarding, and it takes so much time to figure out and understand, and then you just get to such an understanding level of it, it's just like it all starts to make sense. But it literally is real-life motocross in a virtual world. So you could think in your head how long it would take to get to a certain level in real-life riding, right? And by the way, with real-life riding, obviously you have injuries, you have everything else that's, restricting you. Obviously, you can't just go get on a track any second of the day, any time of the night, right? But with MX Simulator, like if you compared the time difference, if you put 10,000 hours of seat time on a real-life dirt bike within like a 4-year, 5-year time period, you're going to be a big hoss on a real-life dirt bike, period. You're going to be a big hoss. You might even be racing pro supercross races in real life. I don't know. But I'm just saying, right? Like if you put that same amount of time into MX Simulator, you have to put that amount of time to really get to that tippity top of the slope. You really do. And all these boys that say they've only put 500 hours into MX Simulator, look at me, I'm winning a pro race, or look at me, I'm doing this. Dog, they're either lying to you, or they're running a micro hack, or they're key sharing. Because you're not going to be able to go in there and win a RF 450 North American Supercross race with only having 500 hours into the game. It's not going to happen, period. I don't even think you'd be able to do it with having 1,000 hours into the game. You're literally going to have 2, 3, 4,000 hours at least to actually be able to go in there and win a RF 450 North American Supercross main event. I ain't talking about the 250 class. I ain't talking about amateurs. I ain't talking about European races. I ain't talking about EMF. I'm talking about 450 RF, the premier division, the premier class, the premier series. That's what I'm talking about. It's going to take you some time, boy. If you're racing legit, which a lot of dumbasses are not even racing legit now, but if you're racing legit, it is going to take you a long time. So it's kind of what comes along with it. But yeah, so just a few general, big tips to some of these simulators. I just wanted to come out here and, kind of give the words of wisdom, give some advice over some of the things I've learned over the years, and I still see it to this day, man. So many people are so concerned about their suspension, and oh my God, I need to make my suspension stiffer. Oh man, Spencer, what do I need to change on my suspension? Meanwhile, they literally don't even remotely have their actual setup, adjusted properly, or they have no idea what rider mass distribution even does, and they're over there fucking around with, rebound clickers. It's like, bro, you're doing it backwards, big dog. So stop worrying so much about your suspension. Go in there and worry about things that's actually changing the movement on the bike. That will help you tremendously. That will save you months of headaches and make you faster, so much faster by doing that. I'm just telling you. So, either way, appreciate you guys watching all the videos. Later, dudes.